What's up YouTube, Capital G here, giving you guys a quick follow-up to the video that I posted yesterday about the brand new Master Rule 5 rule changes and rulings revisions. Whether or not you guys saw this video yesterday, obviously there are some huge changes coming to the OCG, and actually some of these changes are already confirmed for Duel Links, so that kind of tells you that eventually all of these will take place in the TCG. In yesterday's video, I broke down all 5 changes and told you what they meant, tried to put them in layman's terms and give you guys some basic examples that everybody could understand. But for me, reading through the comment section, and I'm not even talking about people memeing, it was clear to me that a lot of people still didn't fully understand, and I figured I'd just go ahead and try to make a quick follow-up video rather than respond to every single person who is still asking if MST or Ghost Ogre negates, or is DD Crow, you know, basically called by the grave now. I just want to go ahead and try to clear that up. Now, from what I can understand, most of these, or some of these, most people kind of got like the one where cards are now going to check the game state. You guys know, like if a Cyber Dragon gets Solemn Warning, you can still immediately activate something like a Card of Demise. Most people understood that type of ruling, but the ruling where cards are moving places before they actually activate their effects, there were still a lot of people who like really didn't understand that. And one thing about monsters returning to the extra deck, I do want to clarify, because I told a couple of people the wrong thing in the comment section. So first off, let me go ahead and tackle that, because that will be a lot quicker. There were some people asking, okay, Cap, so if these extra deck monsters that are returned to the extra deck can no longer activate their effects even if they are mandatory, what does that mean for cards like Gladiator Beast Gryzaris or Ritual Beast Ulti Kanahawk? These monsters both tag themselves back into the deck. I'm not a Ritual Beast expert, but I know for a fact that Gryzaris tags itself back into the deck as a cost, as all Gladiator Beasts do. I mean, this card probably tags itself back into the cost, but honestly, it's irrelevant. Some people were wondering, wait, does this mean that these cards don't work anymore because they put themselves back in the extra deck to summon more monsters? Does that mean that they won't summon the monsters anymore? Okay, so the way that these cards are going to work is the exact way that they work currently. Now, the reason that that is, guys, is because these cards do not activate in the extra deck. They activate on the field, and when you activate on the field, it does not matter where you go after that. As long as your activation on the field happened, and that activation on the field was not negated by a Divine Wrath or a Solemn Strike or something like that, it doesn't matter that these cards can tag, or that these cards must tag themselves back into the extra deck. Even if it is a cost, their effects will still resolve because they were activated successfully on the field. So that's where their effects originate, and that's where their effects will resolve. So these monsters will work exactly as they worked before. Don't go thinking that Gladiator Beast or Ritual Beast are going to be dead under Master Rule 5, because that is untrue. Now, let's go ahead and tackle the nitty gritty, the ruling about, well, card movement and activations and all of that stuff, because there's a lot of people asking me, wait a minute, Cap, does this mean that MST can negate Pot of Desires, or that Ghost Ogre can negate Stratos? Because when these cards are activated, I can just MST them, or I can use a Ghost Ogre on a Stratos. When the chain resolves, the Stratos or the Desires will be in the graveyard, thus they will not resolve. That is not correct, guys. So let me explain the difference between the DD Crow ruling, basically with like Crush Card and Sandgan, and trying to like MST a Desire. So when you activate a card like Mystical Space Typhoon in response to the Pot of Desires, you're not actually stopping the activation of Desires. Let's just play the chain out. So I activate Pot of Desires, paying my cost, banishing the top 10 off the top of my deck. That is Chain Link 1. I pass it to you, ask if you have a response. Your response is Mystical Space Typhoon, targeting my Pot of Desires. You are not actually stopping my activation at that point. Now, you can, when the chain resolves, destroy my Pot of Desires, but it doesn't matter. You haven't actually stopped my activation, thus the card will resolve. In fact, it's pretty much the same thing as the Gladiator Beast Gryzaris. Gryzaris activates on the field. My Desires is activated on the field. It does not matter where you move my card to. You can move this card to the graveyard. You can move it back to my hand. You can move this card to fucking Pluto. It's not going to actually negate it, and you have not stopped my activation with something like a Solemn Judgment or whatever, so it is going to resolve. Stratos is the same exact thing. If I normal summon Stratos, activate the effect, you don't negate my summon, and you don't negate my effect. You try to activate Ghost Ogre or use something like Bottomless Trap Hole that would move Stratos from the field to a different location at resolution of the chain, it won't matter. You're not stopping my actual activation. Stratos is now going to resolve. Now, Let me explain how that differs from if you have a Sangan on the field and you use Crush Card Virus and I DD Crow the Sangan. So the reason that this is different, because as I said in yesterday's video, it mainly has to do with things when you're paying costs. That's going to be probably 95% of this interaction and how you can kind of capitalize off of it. If you activate Crush Card Virus, you have to pay a cost of tributing that dark monster. In this case, it's going to be Sangan. Sangan is already in the graveyard before I even get an opportunity to respond to your Crush Card Virus. So, for instance, if you were to Crush Card Virus me and I use Solemn Judgment, it doesn't matter. Your Sangan's already in the graveyard. You never get the Sangan back. It is sent to the graveyard as part of the cost just to activate this. But in the case of something like DD Crow, if I use DD Crow, in response as Chain Link 2, my DD Crow can target your Sangan, which is already in the graveyard, and it can move it from the graveyard before Sangan even has a chance to activate its effect. I am not negating Sangan's effect. Sangan will never even get an opportunity to activate. When you pay the cost of a card, for instance, Crush Card Virus, or if you activate like a 1-for-1 discarding a Dandelion. I know Dandelion's not legal, but let's just use it for an example. When you pay the cost, you cannot activate the monster effect of something hitting the graveyard in that same chain. That's just not how Yu-Gi-Oh works. You have to give your opponent an opportunity to respond to your card directly, and your card that was probably trying to activate in the graveyard, that's going to go into a new chain. But if your opponent moves that card, then it never gets a chance to activate. Another example would be something like if you use trade-in and you discarded a Danger Bigfoot. The Danger Bigfoot hits the graveyard even before I get a chance to respond to your trade-in. So if I use something like, let's just say I respond directly to the trade-in with the Transmigration Prophecy, me putting the Danger Bigfoot back in your deck means that Danger Bigfoot will never even get an opportunity to activate. I am not negating it, guys. The reason that DD Crow and something like Called by the Grave are different is because Called by the Grave has the word negates, if I can find it. Called by the Grave has the word negates right there in it. Basically, you can kind of think of it like this, guys. It's kind of like the difference between using Skill Drain on your opponent's monsters, where your opponent can still activate monster effects, they're just going to be negated. Skill Drain negates all face-up monster effects on the field, versus something like Outer into the Azathoth, where they can't even activate the monster effects like in general. Once your opponent drops Azathoth on you, you can't even attempt to activate the effect. So in these situations, as I said, 99 or 95%, which are going to kind of revolve around your opponent paying costs. Things like 1-for-1 cards like Trade-In, Crush Card Virus, Link Karibo. Basically, if you can move that monster that wants to activate in the graveyard, if you can move it before that monster activates in another chain, you can actually stop it from happening. I mean, in theory, you can kind of say that it works similar to Called by the Grave because both cards are kind of stopping it, but this would also work with something like an Infernoid monster. If you traded in the Danger Bigfoot to the graveyard and I use one of my Infernoids to just banish your Danger Bigfoot, it would work the same exact way as if I DD Crow'd it or as if I Transmigration Prophesied it. The Danger Bigfoot has to activate in the graveyard, and it's not in the graveyard when the new chain would try to start, so it never even gets a chance. The last thing I want to talk about is kind of an obscure ruling, but it has to do with the trap monsters. Some people were asking this, so we know how the trap monsters basically got buffed. You activate something like Crusader Crawler, it's no longer going to occupy a spell and trap zone. Some people ask, well, Cap, what happens if you book a moon one of these trap monsters? So it's going to work the same exact way, except I believe under one situation. In fact, I think it might work the same exact way. So these trap monsters are still technically considered traps. That did not change from the ruling. This means that if you book a moon a trap monster, it's actually going to reset itself in the spell and trap zone. It doesn't stay face down on the field. If you use something like a Book of Moon on a Crusader Crawler, that card is going to go back to the spell and trap zone. Now, the one thing I will admit I don't actually know the answer to is a specific ruling when you're talking about these trap monsters and how they're going to work. If you happen to have 5 back row in addition to a trap monster on the field, this is something that cannot legally happen right now, because if you have the trap monster, it eats up one of the back row and you can only have a maximum of 4. But moving forward, that's not going to be the case. So the question is, if I have the trap monster on the field field in all my back rows locked up, if my opponent uses Book of Moon or they try to put the trap monster face down, what exactly happens? Can they even attempt to activate the Book of Moon? Because currently these trap monsters want to act as traps first because they are still considered traps. Thus, they want to put themselves set in the back row zone, but I don't know if that would legally work because there's no more back row zones to occupy. Either this card is going to be sent to the graveyard or your opponent's not going to be allowed to even attempt to put them face down because they can't resolve that effect. But I guess we will eventually get a ruling on that because that's something that could come up and Konami will have to address it because it's not something that can currently come up. But one last thing that I do want to address, I probably should have touched on this earlier, is some people were asking why can't a card like DD Crow or Transmigration Prophecy actually stop hand traps, things like Ghost Ogre or Ash Blossom Max C, because these cards are sent to the graveyard as cost. If I use the DD Crow and I banish them, they're no longer in the graveyard. Guys, you have to understand, again, it's all about, did you stop the activation of the effect? Hand traps activate not in the graveyard, they activate in the hand. That is why we call them hand traps. Just because they are sent to the graveyard as a cost does not mean that they activate in the graveyard. Hand traps stop, or hand traps activate in the hand. Thus, if you do not stop those activations, your opponent will resolve those cards. It doesn't matter, as I said before, if you move those cards after they have activated to Pluto or to the moon or to the main deck, whatever, as long as you actually allow them to activate the card, you don't stop its activation with something like a Solemn Strike or a Debunk, your opponent is going to be resolving that effect. The main thing you have to ask yourself with any of these rulings is simple. Did I allow my opponent to activate the effect yet? If you haven't allowed your opponent or they haven't been able to activate the effect yet, you have an opportunity to go in there and stop them. That is the case with all of these cards that pay cost, because cost is paid first and the effects cannot activate when costs are paid, versus these effects that just activate on summon or activate on the field and then you trying to respond to them by moving them. It won't stop those cards in that instance. But I hope this did clear some stuff up. If it did, give the video a thumbs up, guys. Let me know what you thought in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already and turn on that notification bell for daily videos.